Uh, Actually,
Just we're going to end it on time, though, okay?
yeah, sure. Okay, so we have very little time left, and it really has been a long day. So without any further ado, I will very briefly introduce the members of the panel because you have their bios in the program. If you want to learn more about their very impressive experience, you can just look into the brochure. But on my left-hand side here, I have Brock Burman, who is USAID's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. He has an extensive experience in private sector and specifically in emergency management, so maybe we can use your experience from this angle to actually deconstruct the problem of disinformation and see what we can do about it. Jamie Fly, who is now the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Radio Free Europe, and previously he was the co-director of the ASD, Alliance for Securing Democracy, and very extensively involved in fighting disinformation. So I'm very happy to have you on the panel, Jamie. And Ambassador Frederick Lundquist, who is one of the rare species of ambassadors who are specifically dealing with the hybrid warfare and hybrid threats, and I'm very happy to see more and more ministries coming up with the specially designed, very high-level diplomatic ranks to deal with this issue, which once again proves that this is a problem and we have to not only understand the problem, but deal with this somehow. So that's all from my side. I will skip my introduction because we have very little time, and I really expect that we will have a dynamic conversation here, and I will use my privilege as the moderator to ask you a couple of questions before I open it to the audience. So my first question would be for Mr. Burman. Sir, I have read before coming here that there is a very impressive new development framework coming from the USAID specifically for countering malign Kremlin influences. So if you could tell us a bit more about the framework and how this is going to work with Georgia specifically.
Thanks. I'll be brief with my description because I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Frederick and Jamie and yourself. But thank you for the opportunity to come here today and talk a little bit about our countering malign Kremlin influence. And I want to emphasize the word Kremlin. I also want to talk a little bit in terms of bookends, because I think I want to talk about what CMKI is and what CMKI isn't. First off, let me just say that Countering Malign Kremlin Influence, which we launched on the 4th of July in Paris, and independence is the key word there, by no accident, is a message that we wanted to send. CMKI is about independence. It's about giving people the opportunity to make their own choices. And we used the word Kremlin because we wanted to emphasize that this is about Putin, his government, and Russia's government, and not about Russia. And I think that's a key point. We are not asking for people to make a decision between Russia and the United States or Russia and any other country. What we are asking people to make a decision is an informed decision. We're giving them the tools and opportunity to be involved in a number of different aspects and activities that will give them the understanding of their roles and responsibilities. And first off, let me just backtrack a little bit. First off, there are 4 pillars to our CMKI strategic framework. First off is the issue of rule of law and corruption and democracy and governance, followed by an independent media, followed by energy independence, and then finally economic independence. And of course, USAID has been involved with all of those aspects in the past, but what's new about this is how we're looking at what the Kremlin is doing specifically in those areas and how we're countering that narrative. Because at the end of the day, what our feeling is that this is about dependence in terms of how the Kremlin views their narrative versus the United States that wants to give countries the opportunity to make their own choices. I was just before I came on here, I was showing a colleague a very, very slick piece that RT had put together literally within hours after we launched our effort in Paris. And it was a 5.5-minute piece done by RT, which is, by the way, funded to the tune of $300 million along with Sputnik every year to talk about disinformation and frame incorrectly what we're trying to accomplish. And during that piece, it framed it as a United States versus Russia, and that's not the case.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, Russians want the same things that we all want. They want fair and free elections. They want the opportunity to decide their own paths and their journeys. They want the same opportunities for themselves economically. They want to be able to decide where to buy their energy, or where to buy their products, or where to sell their products for that matter. And at the end of the day, our CMKI strategic framework is about giving countries independence and allowing them to chart their own paths forward. I would also say that this has been a cooperative effort. This hasn't been an effort that we just invented over a course of a few days or a few weeks. We've been working on this over the course of the last 2 years since I was confirmed. We've worked cooperatively with both interagencies. We've worked with the Hill, both on the Republican and Democratic side. This has been a very collaborative effort, and we've worked with our Western allies. We had a panel discussion after our launch in Paris where we actually had the Deputy Speaker from Georgia come and participate. We had a member of DG NIR participate, and we've had a member of civil society participate. So we were inclusive in the aspect of what we were trying to accomplish, and that is giving people and giving countries the choice. Again, whether it's to sell their products or buy their energy or make their decisions or be involved with the process, it's a matter of transparency.
Great, thank you so much. And quick follow-up question here. What was the trigger, that was a game changer in your thinking that, okay, now we need a new program. Now this disinformation problem has become so big that we need a new development framework as impressive as you have come up with. So what made you, what pushed you in this direction?
I think it's whether it's an economic, you just look at what happened recently here in Georgia with airlines being prohibited from flying in, and the whole idea that Russians visiting Georgia is dangerous. Georgia is one of the most hospitable countries in the world. It always has been and always will be. And I've been back and forth to this country for 20 years, and really, they have been incredibly hospitable, and frankly, whether it's European or Russian that I've ever talked to, love to come here. And so the idea that Georgia is a dangerous place for Russians is nonsense, and in itself disinformation, but that's just more recent. When I was going through the confirmation process, whether it was the energy issues in parts of our region where they would either hike or hold energy resources, or whether it was just products that they weren't buying at the time to close the borders. It's the idea that we needed to look at this from a broad perspective, both economically, through energy, through disinformation, and then, of course, through elections and through the process of social media.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Jamie, please just share your experience of dealing with this issue for the last couple of years. Especially, I would be interested to hear your opinion about what's the role of media in this. The traditional media versus social media, because in Georgia's case, social media is really huge, but still the primary source of information for most of the Georgians is the TV, so traditional media sources. So what's your experience on this?
Thanks, and thanks to the organizers for tackling this issue again at the Tbilisi International Conference. So I spent my think tank life until 5 weeks ago focused primarily on building resilience against these tactics through some of our work at the German Marshall Fund, which they continue to do great work on. A lot of our focus over those 2 years was very much on the defensive side of tackling this problem, raising awareness, especially in the United States, but also in Western Europe, educating the broader public on the fact that this is a challenge that, even though I think in the past many of us assumed was just a frontline state challenge, but had actually come to the center of Western democracies. And I think that's all important, and there have been great strides that have been made through programs like ours and others in educating people and making people at least more aware. Over time, though, as I worked at the German Marshall Fund, I became increasingly concerned that we weren't going on the offense enough. And now that I think we've at least raised the education level to a certain extent, in Western societies, that's where we need to put more of the focus. So I'm very pleased to see things like the framework, because I see that as part of an effort to actually start pushing back and dealing with this challenge. I mean, I think the problem we face, as we've been focused more on the defensive aspect, is that the threat has continued to evolve and proliferate. It's both evolved in terms of the platforms that are being used, both traditional media and social media. The very concerning thing that I've watched, and even just in recent weeks in my job at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty have seen, is the privatization of the tactics as well. It's not just that it proliferated to more and more states, and we've even seen some Western governments or friendly governments start to adopt some of these tactics. You can now do disinformation for hire, essentially, in some of these countries, where you can hire a company, an outside firm, sometimes in your own country, sometimes externally in Russia, that will do these social media attacks for you. And we've been the target of that at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and some of our services. And so that's concerning as well. I do think that we need to make sure that we don't forget traditional media. And so, you know, I've been very interested to see the work that we're doing at RFERL, and part of it is, you know, shoring up some of that independent, objective reporting in these key media markets. Georgia, I think, is a good example in a very partisan, polarized media environment, having outlets that are objective.
Example, I would say.
Yeah. And so providing, you know, not just pushing back on individual pieces of disinformation, but being those sources of news that consumers can go to, where they realize that it's free from that broader disinformation environment and they can trust and rely on. And so I also have seen in the framework that part of what I think USAID is doing is actually supporting those independent outlets. And I think that's very positive, because as Brock noted, we are seeing the Russians in particular invest heavily in that traditional media space, whether it's Sputnik or Russia Today. And I will just say for the record that RFERL does not have a budget, an annual budget of $300 million.
Yeah.
We have a sizable budget, but it's nowhere near what is being spent by the Russians in many of the same countries in which we're operating.
Yeah, great. And specifically, one question regarding the legal approaches. So in your experience of working with the disinformation, have you seen any good examples, especially if we go back to the Georgian example? There is a lot of hate speech and call for violence, and I mentioned extreme nationalist narratives, which are dominating actually Russian propaganda. And you see a lot of hate speech and call for violence and absolutely unacceptable violent campaigns which are being unfolded. So in this context, do you see any good examples and success stories in terms of legal solutions to the problem?
In the work that we did at the German Marshall Fund, and I still believe this, I think it's a very slippery slope when you try to regulate speech. And I know there's been some discussion of that here. That starts to have a chilling effect on traditional media. It creates an opening for politicians who want to pressure and shut out certain voices in the media space. I just came from Central Asia 10 days ago, where I visited 3 of our bureaus, and I think the last thing we want to do is give governments more avenues to try to stifle speech or to harass journalists, like many of our people are being harassed throughout Central Asia. Our bureaus are being threatened with closure. And so no matter how well-intentioned, I think that's a dangerous precedent. I do think the way to regulate it is, especially in the social media side, is through better engagement with the social media platforms. And that's where they have clear standards that they all say they're abiding by. They should make sure that people actually adhere to those. They should make sure that their algorithms are as transparent as possible, so that they're not actually amplifying and exaggerating the extent of that hate speech online. And so I think those are the better ways to approach the issue, rather than trying to regulate speech.
And I would just add that it's important that we look at the education of how to analyze that information. It's important, obviously, to have one aspect of it be an independent media, but it's also important to have people understand the difference, or for them to understand the difference between fake news and fake content and incorrect information or propaganda. So, you know, we need to do a better job of helping people understand the differences so that they can make an informed decision.
Great, thank you. Ambassador, I have read your recent publication in Rusi, and I really loved it. A lot of very interesting points. But I wanted to ask you specifically regarding two problems: raising awareness on how much problem we're facing and building resilience against it. Because this is my favorite word in terms of explaining what we have to do to push back propaganda. Because if we start chasing every instance of fake news and disinformation, then we are dragged down into the battlefield where we are going to lose this fight. So building resilience actually is one of the key solutions. But I loved the way you framed it. It's not a rocket science. Yes, well, I got it. It's not a rocket science. But what's your experience? How are we able to build resilience against this, the campaigns that we have to face?
Thank you, Shota, for this. And I think building resilience, and I will answer your question, is a very important part. But managing and fighting disinformation, like any hybrid threat, basically consists of three elements. The first one is you need to be able to detect it and analyze and understand it. The second one is building resilience. And the third one is actually doing something about it, developing countermeasures and so forth. Clearly, building resilience is very important. But in order to do that, you have to have this awareness. In Sweden, there has been a long tradition, and there's a new momentum of this, of educating in schools and educating the population and so forth. There has been a government decision in Sweden to reinstate the government agency of psychological defense, which will start next year. We had this during the Cold War, then we closed it down some 15 years ago, and we're putting it up again. And that also means ahead of the Swedish parliamentary elections last year, we have another Swedish government agency for civil contingencies who were actively involved in educating Swedish government officials, not only in central government, but also in local government and so forth, but also politicians about the dangers and campaigns can come up. You can do a lot on the national level, but this is an issue which also has to be tackled in international solidarity and international cooperation. And we also have to be able to detect and see and analyze what's going on in different countries and different fronts, and because only then we can sort of see the picture of the puzzle, what's going on. And there has been a lot on the international arena within the EU. The EU adopted last year a special action plan on countering disinformation. There's a very effective the European Union External Action Service has a special body that deals with this, the EU Stratcom East, and you can look it up on internet. It's EU versus Disinfo. And they publish every week a newsletter with something like 60 to 80 cases of Russian disinformation. And this is all in a public, it's open, transparent database. And up to date, they have gathered more than 6,000 cases of Russian disinformation. I come from an exotic, strange country in the north, where we have strange things in the forest called trolls. But we also know that the best way to deal with trolls is to expose them for daylight. I think governments has an important role in this, but not least, good quality journalism, but also civil society. So I'm very happy to hear about this initiative, because this is an important part of our common effort to fight this.
And you mentioned the role of the government, and let me once again try to link this back to Georgia's case. There is a parliamentary opposition party, pro-Russian party, which constantly comes up with anti-NATO campaigns. And one of the main narratives they have is that Georgia should be a neutral state and it should not irritate Russia, by trying to become a NATO member, and then we have to behave, we have to say that we're not going to NATO and all problems with Russia will go away, which of course is a lie. And very recently, we, under our project, also identified this trend as one of the most active and orchestrated campaigns, which was supported by a number of different players and actors in the Georgia's information environment. But what we have not really seen is the response to the absolutely unbased lies that they used during these campaigns. For example, very easy to track down, right? Georgia's defense budget has a heavy burden of 1 billion, which we have to pay for NATO. And we could use this money to finance some private companies and to help families start their businesses. This is absolute bullshit, sorry, pardon my French, but I have not heard any strategic communications department that we have a lot in the Prime Minister's office, Defense Minister's office, Foreign Minister's office, actually coming out and saying that, okay, defense budget is transparent. This is what we pay and this is what we pay for. And there is nothing like that in this. So if we do not see the resolve or capacity by the governments to deal with such a complicated problem as it is, well, what's going to be your advice to the people who really care deeply about this?
I'm very careful about giving advice to other governments, and I can't really comment on the situation in Georgia. I think it's important to make the difference between, on the one hand, when we see antagonistic state actors like Russia in this case, performing aggressive antagonistic acts against you. And using various channels, and this is a security policy issue. This is a threat and a security policy issue, and should be discussed as such. Then, of course, in any open, free, democratic society, you have normal political opinion formation, discussions, and everyone is allowed to have their own views and opinions on this. And I would just be very cautious for any government to try to steer or guide the domestic political discussion, and because if we start doing that, we fall exactly into the trap of where I think Russia wants us to go, or to limit free expression and free speech, or regulate media. But I think you mentioned the answer yourself, and that is, of course, strategic communication, Stratcom, which is the flip side of disinformation, so to say. One effective means has to be effective strategic communication. We've had in Sweden cases of Russian media either portraying Sweden as an extremely militaristic country, or that we have a radical, impotent army. Both narratives are out there, and there has even been fake letters that sort of allegedly signed by the Swedish defense minister, which is a total fake, being spread out, and that has to be, of course, countered with strategic communication.
Yeah. Jamie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I agree with Frederick. I think governments need to tread carefully. It's not that they shouldn't try to respond and get the facts out, but all of the research I've seen when you're responding to disinformation, sometimes the government is actually the least effective agent that can respond to a specific piece of disinformation. Many publics, including in the West and the United States, they're skeptical of even things that the federal government says. And so that's really why you do need, I think, that trusted, objective, independent media in these countries, including here in Georgia, which I think a role that our service plays, that isn't seen as picking a side, and that actually can describe all sides of the story. Is not just responding to a specific allegation, but is covering it in the broadest way possible, in the fairest way possible, and is already trusted by the audience. And I think the thing that concerns me in a lot of the countries in which we operate is you're seeing this closing of the media space where everyone has a political agenda of one sort or the other, and the space for the truly independent media is becoming smaller and smaller, and it's more difficult for them to continue to operate.
I would just add that a vibrant civil society will also help you in terms of transparency and getting information out and helping people make an informed decision.
Yeah, but it's supposed to help, right? Not to do all the job.
That's exactly.
Okay, so let me open this to the audience. Let's take a couple of questions and then let's conclude with some final remarks, as we have as much as 6 minutes. So please, questions. Yeah, one of the best fighters against fake news and myths in Georgia. She's doing a great job. So Tamara, please give us hard time with your question.
Thank you, Tamar Kinzurashvili, Media Development Foundation. Since you mentioned trolls, I have a question. Besides information in, operation from outside country, Georgian government duplicates Kremlin methods to undermine trust in civil society organization towards the political opponent, critical media outlets. They are using trolls factory against all these actors, and how is this dangerous for our democratic development? And second question is about transparency of sources and tracking inflow of funds, because when we are talking about Kremlin propaganda, it's not Sputnik Georgia or Russia Today. Mainly they are Georgian language fringe media outlets inciting hate speech and trying to create tensions, trigger historic trauma with neighboring Turkey. It's not direct appeal and support for Russia, but undermining trust and creating threats from all neighboring countries besides Russia. And their major narrative now is that fight with, confrontation with Russia, it's not our business. This is a fight between two big powers, not, and we are Georgians sacrificing our interests for the sake of our strategic partners.
Thank you, Tamara. James Nixie here, please pass the mic. Yeah. And then Mikhail Baranovsky here, third question, and then we'll bring it back to the panel. Please.
Yeah, thanks, James Nixie, Chatham House. Thank you for your presentation, it's very inspiring. But could I just suggest that information warfare, important as it is only one small part, really 1/4 of political warfare, political warfare at Russia campaigns, anything that's not military, which also includes anything from cyber to industrial to diplomatic. These are all parts of Russia's political warfare committed against all of our countries. That's part one. Part two, you mentioned, sir, at the end about exposing the trolls, and I just wonder if we're pushing in different directions here, because I tend to take the view that rather than exposing the trolls, we shouldn't be feeding them, and we should be ignoring them. And I at least think that's something worth discussing, so that we're not pulling in different directions.
Yeah, Mikhail Baranovsky, GMF here.
Michał, GMF. Thank you for a fascinating panel. Jamie, you started talking about going on the offense. And I would love to push the panel a little bit further, and maybe you are the most comfortable in answering, given that it's a little bit harder for government officials. But in the West, we are the most successful democracies, markets, and we are getting beaten, but much less successful governments, in this case, Russia. What can we do going further on the offense? What can we do beyond the resilience and defense in our societies? Is there something that, if we had a little bit more of a debate of how we do it, that we could actually do toward Russia itself? Thanks.
Okay, so I think we have more than enough food for thought here in these questions to try to wrap up this, and I will give you the floor for your final comments, and let's try to wrap up this panel.
I would just start by saying it has to be a broad approach. It can't just be in the media, independent media space. It can't be in the disinformation space. It has to be a broad approach that we're taking, whether it's in energy independence or whether it's in economic development, giving countries more opportunity to sell their goods to a wider market will give those countries a better outcome in general. What I'm suggesting is that people who have more economic opportunities will have more freedoms to make decisions and be participatory with the process. I also think that given rule of law and corruption and policies, how we frame our first leg, which is understanding how governments have a responsibility as well to support civil society and support media, is beyond just supporting the media by itself, right? It's making sure that government understands their role in terms of supporting an independent media. So I think it's a broad approach. I hope that answers to some degree your question. From the aid perspective, we have to take what I think is a broad approach that counters what I think is a broad approach from the Kremlin and from Putin himself. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy.
On the question of going on the offense, I mean, there are plenty of ways that governments can go on the offense in terms of sanctions, various policy, to pressure the Russians as they continue to do this. I'll set that aside given the current hat I wear. What we are trying to do in the independent media space is to provide alternative sources of information to Russians, including in Russia, which I think is an important part of this, which often gets overlooked. This is not just a frontline state problem. This is a problem for average Russian citizens who don't have access to a diversity of viewpoints and free and independent media. And so we've done that at RFERL with things like a 24/7 Russian language TV network that we've set up in the last 5 years. We do live coverage of the Moscow protests almost every weekend for the last several months. And we think that providing those alternative sources of information that are fair and balanced and objective, just showing what's actually happening, is a big part of this that should make, I think, the Russian government realize that they can't just continue to push these buttons in our democracy without some sort of repercussions for them. The one final thing I'll say is on the issue of exposing versus feeding trolls, I have similar concerns, honestly, because it was important, I think, in our societies that we expose the ecosystem and how it works. But there is a danger now, because I think that's contributed to the proliferation of these tactics. And so I think we need to be very careful in the future about how public we are with exposing every aspect of these networks, because even friendly governments, or like I said at the beginning, private entities are now duplicating these efforts. And so unless we're willing to focus on norms and actually getting people to sign up to certain rules of the road, I think we need to be careful about contributing to further proliferation.
Well, I wish we had more time for this very interesting discussion, but Frederick, you got your final 2 minutes, and that's it. We have to wrap it up.
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief. Just on the comment, I mean, of course, media pluralism, civil society plays in a very important role on this. Totally right. I mean, disinformation is only one means of hybrid threats or antagonistic state activities. And the question is, how do you counter that? And that's an interesting discussion going on in the security policy circuits. I think, you know, detecting and understanding the threat is one thing. That's not rocket science. Building resilience, it's not rocket science, but actually how to build effective, you know, a defense, active defense, and countering hybrid threats is a little bit of, you know, we are now looking for the answers to this. And it has to be, because disinformation is part of a coordinated effort, state effort to achieve something. The answer also has to be coordinated and holistic. And some of it governments can do, and some of it governments can and should not do. So therefore we spoke both of this whole of government approach, but also whole of society approach, where media and civil society has a role to play. I just tried to make a fun joke of Swedish trolls. My idea is not, you know, we shouldn't be feeding the trolls, but then again, exposing the message or that is in this, and I think a very good example is done by this EU Stratcom East. I think Bellingcat, Fake News, and Stop Fake and others have done a fantastic work of this. So I think still daylight is where we should have this discussion.
Well, great, great. So if there is one takeaway from this panel, for me it would be that this is a huge problem. We started to realize this is a huge problem, so there are some steps in the direction of good awareness on the problem. And the solution looks like to be a all-of-a-nation approach, so no one is, has to be missing from the chain. private sector, government, and think tank community, and CSOs, we all have to actually fight a coherent war together to build our resilience and actually tackle the problem in a good way. So thank you very much for this, and this concludes the panel.